What if a sitting president was wanted by the world's most powerful nation? Not accused, charged, not hidden, still ruling. A man with a $15 million bounty on his head, yet walking free, giving speeches, commanding a nation. This is not a movie. This is Venezuela. Once one of the richest countries in South America, a land floating on the largest oil reserves on Earth, Venezuela today is a nation of empty shelves, broken currency, and millions forced to flee. And at the center of it all stands Nicolas Maduro. To some, he is a defender of sovereignty. To others, a dictator propped up by power and fear. To the United States, he is something far more serious, a criminal accused of narco-terrorism. So how did a country with so much wealth fall so hard? Why did the United States place sanctions so severe they reshaped daily life for millions? And most importantly, can a world superpower really arrest a sitting president? This video is not propaganda. It is not outrage. It is context. We will break down how Venezuela reached this breaking point, the real story behind U.S. sanctions, the arrest warrant that shook global politics, and what this conflict means for the future of power, oil, and sovereignty. Because this is not just Venezuela's story. This is a lesson about power, about control, and about what happens when politics, ideology, and oil collide. Let's begin with the country that has everything and yet lost almost all of it. To understand why Venezuela matters, we must first understand where it stands in the world. Venezuela is not a small, irrelevant nation. It sits in northern South America with direct access to the Caribbean Sea, one of the most strategically important maritime regions on Earth. But geography is only the beginning. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves in the world. More than Saudi Arabia, more than Iran, more than Russia. Oil is not just fuel. Oil is power. It decides who trades, who sanctions, who negotiates, and who gets isolated. For decades, Venezuela supplied oil to the United States itself. The two nations were once economic partners, not enemies. So the question is not, why does the U.S. care about Venezuela? The real question is, how could it not? Venezuela is also geopolitically critical. It lies just hours away from the U.S. mainland, yet it has built strong alliances with America's rivals, Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba. In global politics, proximity matters. And when influence shifts near powerful borders, tensions rise. Beyond oil and alliances, there is another reason Venezuela matters: precedent. If a resource-rich country can openly challenge Western power, reject international pressure, and still survive, it sends a message to the rest of the world, a dangerous one for some, an inspiring one for others. Finally, Venezuela matters because of its people. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled their country, one of the largest migration crises in modern history. This is not just an economic collapse. It is a human one. And when human crises spill across borders, they become global problems. So Venezuela is not just a failed economy, not just a political conflict, not just a headline. It is a crossroads of oil, ideology, power, and people. And at that crossroads stands a government the United States wants removed and a president it wants arrested. Now that we understand why Venezuela matters, we can ask the next question: how did it all begin? To understand Venezuela today, we must go back to 1998. That year, a former army officer named Hugo Chavez was elected president. Chavez did not rise as a traditional politician. He rose as a symbol of anger against inequality, corruption, and elite rule. Chavez promised something radical. He called it the Bolivarian Revolution, a vision inspired by Simón Bolívar, the liberator of South America. At its core, the revolution had three pillars: state control of oil, massive welfare programs, rejection of U.S. influence. For a time, it worked. High global oil prices funded social programs, reduced poverty, and made Chavez extremely popular among the poor. But beneath the success, structural problems were growing. Private industries weakened, foreign investment slowed. The economy became almost entirely dependent on oil. When oil prices fell, Venezuela had no backup plan. In 2013, Hugo Chavez died of cancer. Power passed to his chosen successor, Nicolas Maduro. Maduro inherited the presidency, but not Chavez's charisma, not his authority, and not the economic conditions that once supported the system. Under Maduro, the crisis deepened. Hyperinflation destroyed savings. Food and medicine shortages spread. Millions left the country. As protests grew, Maduro tightened control over institutions, the judiciary, and the military. Opposition voices were sidelined, and elections were increasingly questioned by international observers. The United States, European Union, and several Latin American nations accused Maduro of undermining democracy. Sanctions followed, targeting oil exports, financial systems, and government officials. Maduro, in response, accused the U.S. of economic warfare. This turned Venezuela into something more than a domestic crisis. It became a global standoff. On one side, a government claiming sovereignty and resistance. On the other, a superpower insisting on democratic restoration. And at the center of this confrontation stands one man, Nicolas Maduro. The next question is inevitable. How did this political crisis turn into an international arrest demand? By the mid-2000s, Venezuela's crisis was no longer internal. It had international consequences. The United States began imposing targeted sanctions on Venezuela, first against individuals, then against institutions, and eventually against the oil sector, the backbone of Venezuela's economy. Washington's stated goal was clear: pressure the government, restore democratic processes, force negotiations. Maduro's government rejected this narrative. They argued that sanctions were not targeted. They were collective punishment. According to Caracas, sanctions accelerated shortages, blocked access to international credit, and deepened the humanitarian crisis. At the same time, Venezuela's opposition gained international attention. In 2019, opposition leader Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president, citing constitutional provisions. The U.S., several European nations, and parts of Latin America recognized Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate leader. This created an unprecedented dual-power situation. Two presidents, two claims to legitimacy, one deeply divided nation. Maduro retained control of the military, state institutions, key economic assets. Without military support, the opposition struggled to convert recognition into real power. As tensions escalated, dialogue attempts repeatedly failed. Negotiations in Norway, Mexico, and elsewhere collapsed under mutual distrust. Meanwhile, protests were met with arrests, and opposition figures faced legal pressure. Then came the most explosive development. The United States accused Nicolas Maduro and senior Venezuelan officials of involvement in narcotics trafficking and organized crime. In 2020, U.S. authorities announced criminal indictments, placing bounties on Maduro and his inner circle. For Washington, this was a law enforcement action. For Caracas, it was an act of political aggression. From this moment onward, the conflict crossed a new line. It was no longer just diplomacy or sanctions. It became a matter of international law, arrest warrants, and global enforcement. The question now was no longer who should govern Venezuela, but instead, can a sitting head of state be arrested across borders? When headlines say Maduro arrest warrant or U.S. wants Maduro arrested, it is important to pause, because words matter. First, a key clarification. The United States has issued criminal indictments, not an international arrest order enforceable everywhere. This distinction is critical. The charges filed by U.S. authorities include allegations of drug trafficking, conspiracy with armed groups, money laundering. These are accusations, not convictions. Under international law, Maduro remains presumed innocent until proven otherwise. Now the most important legal reality. A sitting head of state generally enjoys sovereign immunity. This means he cannot be arrested in his own country. He cannot be forcibly removed by another state. He cannot be extradited without legal process unless very specific international mechanisms are involved. There is no International Criminal Court, ICC, arrest warrant against Maduro. That matters, because ICC warrants, like those for war crimes or crimes against humanity, operate differently from national indictments. So what can happen? If Maduro travels to a country that recognizes U.S. jurisdiction and chooses to cooperate, he could face legal action. Assets could be frozen. Officials around him could be detained. But none of this is automatic. This is why Maduro rarely travels to countries closely aligned with the United States. Instead, he visits nations that reject U.S. jurisdiction or maintain strategic alliances with Venezuela. Another important point, bounties announced by the U.S. are symbolic pressure tools. They are designed to isolate leadership, encourage defections, increase diplomatic leverage. They do not mean bounty hunters can legally act worldwide. So the reality is this: Maduro is not a fugitive under international law. He is not wanted by Interpol. He is not under a global arrest mandate, but he is one of the most legally and diplomatically constrained leaders in the world. This leads to the bigger strategic question. If arrest is unlikely, then why apply this level of pressure at all? A natural question arises: if the United States believes Nicolas Maduro is illegitimate, and if criminal charges exist, why not intervene directly? The answer lies in strategy, law, and global consequences. First, international law. Direct military intervention against a sovereign state without UN authorization would violate global norms and set a dangerous precedent. The U.S. understands that what it does today can be used as justification by others tomorrow. Second, regional stability. Venezuela sits in a sensitive region. Any military action could destabilize Colombia and Brazil, trigger mass refugee flows, escalate into proxy conflicts. Latin America has a long memory of foreign interventions. Another one would invite backlash. Third, cost and unpredictability. Military interventions rarely end quickly. They demand long-term occupation, nation rebuilding, political ownership of outcomes. Washington has learned from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya that regime change does not guarantee stability. So instead, the U.S. chose a pressure-based model. This includes economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, legal indictments, support for opposition groups. The goal is not invasion. The goal is internal pressure leading to negotiation or transition. Another factor is global optics. The U.S. wants to appear as defending democracy, not imposing leadership. By avoiding force, it maintains moral leverage in international forums. At the same time, pressure keeps options open. Sanctions can be tightened or eased. Negotiations can restart. Diplomacy remains possible. Force, once used, cannot be undone. This strategy also sends a broader message to other governments watching closely. It says, you may control your territory, but access to the global financial system is conditional. Yet this approach has limits. Pressure can isolate, but it can also harden resistance. Which brings us to the next layer of the story. How has Maduro survived despite all this pressure? Despite sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and international pressure, Nicolas Maduro remains in power. This did not happen by accident. First, control of the military. In Venezuela, the armed forces are not just defenders of borders. They are deeply embedded in governance, state-owned companies, internal security. Maduro ensured loyalty through promotions, influence, and institutional power. As long as the military stands with him, forced removal remains unlikely. Second, institutional dominance. Maduro's government controls the Supreme Court, the electoral authority, key ministries. This allowed him to manage political outcomes, limit opposition momentum, and shape legal narratives. Third, strategic international alliances. Venezuela is not isolated globally. It maintains strong ties with Russia, China, Iran, Turkey. These partnerships provide alternative trade routes, financial lifelines, diplomatic cover. In international forums, these allies block unified action against Caracas. Fourth, economic adaptation. Sanctions forced Venezuela to change how it survives. The government used informal trade networks, increased gold exports, shifted toward regional and non-dollar transactions. This did not fix the economy, but it kept the state functional. Fifth, fragmented opposition. Venezuela's opposition has struggled with internal divisions. Competing leaders, conflicting strategies, and public fatigue weakened its ability to challenge power consistently. Maduro benefited from this disunity. Finally, narrative control. Maduro frames the crisis as a fight against imperialism, economic warfare by foreign powers, a defense of national sovereignty. This messaging resonates with parts of the population and reinforces loyalty among supporters. Together, these elements form a survival system, not strength in one area, but resilience across many. Which leads us to a broader question. If this stalemate continues, who benefits and who pays the price? While governments argue, while sanctions are debated, while power struggles continue, ordinary Venezuelans carry the real burden. Over the last decade, Venezuela has faced one of the largest humanitarian crises outside a war zone. Hyperinflation erased savings, salaries lost meaning, basic goods became scarce. For many families, daily life turned into survival. Hospitals struggled with shortages. Medicines became difficult to access. Once preventable illnesses became life-threatening. Education suffered too. Schools lacked resources. Teachers left the profession. An entire generation faced disrupted learning. Then came mass migration. More than 7 million Venezuelans left the country over time, one of the largest displacement movements in modern history. They walked across borders, worked informal jobs, and rebuilt lives far from home. Not out of choice, but necessity. Inside Venezuela, those who stayed adapted in difficult ways. Families relied on remittances. Communities shared resources. People turned to informal economies to survive. Resilience became routine. At the same time, the political conflict affected trust. Many Venezuelans felt caught between competing narratives. One side blaming sanctions, another blaming governance. For most people, the question was simpler. When will life become normal again? Sanctions added complexity. While designed to pressure leadership, they also restricted access to international banking, imports, investment. Humanitarian exemptions existed, but implementation was uneven. The result was a population caught between policy and reality. Yet despite everything, Venezuelans continue to show dignity. Markets still open, families still gather, culture, music, and identity endure. This reminds us of something important. Behind every geopolitical headline are millions of lives trying to move forward, which brings us to the final strategic layer. If the stalemate continues, what comes next for Venezuela and the world? The crisis in Venezuela is often framed as a regional issue, but in reality, the consequences are global. First, energy markets. Venezuela holds one of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. When its production collapsed, global supply tightened. This affected oil prices energy security, regional fuel availability. For consuming nations, Venezuela's instability meant higher uncertainty in already volatile markets. Second, migration pressure. Millions of Venezuelans did not disappear. They moved to Colombia, to Peru, to Brazil, to the United States and Europe. This reshaped labor markets, strained public services, and influenced domestic politics in multiple countries. Third, the precedent problem. How the world handles Venezuela sets an example. If sanctions and pressure succeed, they validate non-military tools as instruments of change. If they fail, they raise a hard question. How much leverage does the international system really have? Fourth, great power competition. Venezuela became a testing ground for global influence. The U.S. and its allies on one side, Russia, China, and Iran on the other. This is not just about Venezuela. It is about who shapes the rules of the world order. Fifth, international law credibility. Indictments without enforcement, sanctions without resolution, and negotiations without outcomes all weaken trust in global mechanisms. When rules exist but cannot be applied evenly, confidence erodes. Yet, there is also something to gain. The Venezuelan case has shown the limits of force, the cost of isolation, the importance of dialogue. It has pushed governments to rethink how pressure should be applied and when it should be lifted. Ultimately, the world does not just watch Venezuela, it learns from it. And this leads us to the final question of this story. After years of stalemate, pressure, and human cost, is there a way forward? The story of Venezuela is not just about Nicolas Maduro. It is not just about the United States. It is not just about sanctions or arrest claims. It is about power, how it is gained, how it is challenged, and how long it can be held. This crisis shows us something uncomfortable. In today's world, law and power do not always move together. Indictments can exist without arrests. Sanctions can exist without change. Pressure can exist without resolution. It also reminds us of the limits of force. Military action is easy to talk about, but costly to execute. Pressure is safer, but slower, and often uneven in its impact. And in between these strategies stand ordinary people, families adapting, communities surviving, a nation waiting. Venezuela's future will not be decided by a single warrant, a single election, or a single foreign policy decision. It will be shaped by internal reconciliation, economic rebuilding, international engagement without domination. There is no shortcut. For the world, Venezuela is a lesson in humility, a lesson in restraint, a lesson in remembering that behind every headline are human lives. And for us as viewers, the real question is not who wins this standoff. The real question is, what kind of world do we accept when power outpaces justice and when people pay the price? If you found this analysis valuable, follow the channel for daily deep dive explainers. The next videos will explore other global power standoffs, international law versus geopolitics, conflicts beyond the headlines. Until then, stay informed, stay thoughtful, and keep questioning. According to multiple international news reports, the United States has carried out what has been described as a large-scale military strike in Venezuela, resulting in the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. The operation reportedly took place in the early hours of January 3, 2026, with explosions and military activity reported around 2 a.m. in Caracas. During this operation, U.S. forces allegedly apprehended Maduro and his wife at a residence in the capital. From there, the couple was flown out of Venezuela and taken into U.S. custody. Maduro was then brought to the United States and arrived in New York, where he is being held under federal custody. The charges Maduro is expected to face include U.S. federal accusations related to narco-terrorism, cocaine importation conspiracy, and related drug trafficking offenses, stemming from a long-standing indictment unsealed in U.S. courts. Officials say the operation was conducted in conjunction with U.S. law enforcement and military elements. Testimony from U.S. leaders suggests coordination between special forces and federal agencies. Following the capture, former U.S. President Donald Trump addressed the nation, stating that the United States would temporarily run Venezuela and oversee a transition, while also indicating plans to restore and manage Venezuelan oil infrastructure. Trump's comments underscored the significance of the operation, describing Maduro as a kingpin of a criminal network and asserting that the U.S. would ensure Venezuela's stability and security. Photographs and videos shared online show supporters and opponents reacting in Venezuela and abroad, including celebrations by some expatriate communities and protests by Maduro's supporters. International reaction has been mixed, with some governments condemning the U.S. action as a violation of sovereignty and others acknowledging the legal and security implications. Maduro is now expected to appear in a U.S. federal court in New York to face the charges against him, which could begin with an arraignment in the Southern District of New York later in the week. This development represents a rare and dramatic turn of events in international politics, one that may influence U.S.-Latin America relations, international law debates, and future global power dynamics. Whether you support him or oppose him, one thing is undeniable: Donald Trump is a game changer. Trump represents a style of leadership that prioritizes strength, deterrence, and national interest above diplomatic hesitation. His approach sends a clear message to adversaries: the United States will not tolerate regimes accused of corruption, narcotics trafficking, or destabilizing global security.